She kept the gloves on at all times. Even in August, when the parlour on Fenwick Lane grew so stifling that the candles bent sideways in the heat, Delia Marsh kept her gloves on. White cotton in summer, dark wool come winter. She owned 6 pairs. Nora had counted them once while tidying the chest in the corner, and not a single one showed its lining, because Delia Marsh had never, not once in the 4 months Nora had worked in this house, removed them in front of another living soul. Nora Bassett was 26 years old, the daughter of a country magistrate who had died owing more than he'd earned, and she had taken the position of lady's companion to Mrs. Delia Marsh because the alternative was her aunt's house in Bristol and a life of slow suffocation. She was good with figures, better with silence, and she had learned, early on in her father's courtroom, how to read a room the way other women read letters. Carefully, between the lines, with an eye toward what was being concealed, rather than what was being said. What Delia Marsh was concealing, Nora had not yet determined. She knew the basics. Delia was 31, widowed 2 years prior, husband a minor wool merchant who'd left her a modest income and no children, and a house that was slightly too large for one woman to rattle around in alone. She was not unhappy, exactly. She was contained. She moved through her own rooms like a guest who had not been told how long she was staying. Careful, unobtrusive, always angled slightly toward the door. Then the letter arrived from Greyhollow. Nora was the one who brought it in from the Morning Post, and she saw the seal before Delia did. A silver wax impression of a stag's head, which she would later learn was the mark of the Earl of Ashvane. She set it on the breakfast table without comment. She watched Delia's face do something complicated. Then Delia set down her tea, picked up the letter, and read it twice without saying a word. "We'll be travelling north," Delia said finally. "My late husband's family has invited us for the autumn. 3 weeks at Greyhollow Hall." Use, Nora noted the word. "Not I have been invited." "Us, of course," Nora said. "Shall I begin packing?" "Yes." Delia folded the letter into quarters, precise as origami. "And Nora, the gloves. I'll need all of them." Greyhollow Hall sat on the edge of the North Yorkshire moors like something that had been there since before anyone thought to name the land beneath it. Stone the colour of old pewter, windows narrow and deep-set, like eyes that had learned to be suspicious. The carriage road curved through 1/2 mile of open heath before the house revealed itself properly. And when it did, Nora understood for the first time why Delia had gripped the window frame the entire last hour of the journey. She had been here before. That much was obvious. What was less obvious was why she had come back. The Earl of Ashvane, Callum, Delia's late husband's older brother, met them in the entrance hall. He was tall in the way that old houses produce tall men, slightly stooped at the shoulder as though the doorframes had spent decades reminding him to mind his head. Dark hair going silver at the temples, eyes a particular shade of grey that Nora associated with early morning and unfinished thoughts. He shook Delia's hand with both of his, which was not the greeting of a man who found this visit merely convenient. "You came," he said. "Just that." "You asked," Delia said, and something in the way she said it, not accusing, not forgiving, just stating, made Nora step back half a pace, because whatever was between these two people had nothing to do with wool merchants or inheritance, and everything to do with years. The house was full. That surprised Nora. She'd imagined a quiet family visit, the Earl, perhaps a handful of servants, the particular hush of a country estate in autumn. Instead, there were 12 guests already installed when they arrived. Callum's sister, Mrs. Winifred Potts, a narrow-faced woman with the smile of someone practicing for a portrait. Winifred's husband, who laughed too loudly at his own observations. A collection of neighbours and business associates whose names Nora catalogued and promptly organised by usefulness. An elderly aunt who seemed to be asleep standing up at the tea table. And Winifred's eldest daughter, Louisa, who was 19 and already bored of everyone in the room. Nora watched Louisa watching Delia and felt something shift behind her sternum. Instinct, she would have called it. Her father had talked about instinct in the context of juries. How a good juror trusted the feeling that something was wrong before they had the evidence to name what it was. The evidence, he'd said, was just the feeling made legible. Louisa Potts was looking at Delia's gloves. The first 3 days passed pleasantly enough. Morning rides, afternoon teas, a tour of the estate's walled garden, which Callum conducted with the distracted intensity of a man who genuinely loved his ground more than his company. Delia walked beside him, and Nora walked 2 paces behind, and she watched the way their conversation worked, halting, careful, full of the particular silences of people who have said the wrong thing before and are now very deliberate about what they allow out of their mouths. She pieced together the history the way her father had taught her to piece together a case, fragments, impressions, things said and unsaid. Delia had grown up not far from here, the magistrate's daughter of a neighbouring county, the kind of girl who reads too much and knows too much and is therefore considered alarming. She had been, at 23, intended for Callum, not formally, not with contracts, but in the way that 2 families understand a thing without writing it down. Then Callum's father had died, and the estate had come to him encumbered, and there had been money problems Nora couldn't fully reconstruct, and Delia had married James Marsh, Callum's younger brother, the wool merchant, instead. James had been kind. Nora gathered this from the way Delia spoke of him, which was with a gentleness that had nothing desperate in it. She had been content, not happy the way novels describe happiness, not the kind that makes a woman reach for superlatives. Content, whole, enough. Then James died, and now here they were. "She's in love with him," Louisa said to her mother on the 3rd evening, in the corridor outside the drawing room, not quite quietly enough. "Anyone can see it. And he's making a fool of himself, following her around the garden like a shepherd's dog." Nora, who was carrying a stack of sheet music Delia had requested from the library, stopped walking. "Louisa," Winifred said, and her tone was more instruction than rebuke. "It's obvious," Louisa continued, "and she's not even a proper widow. 2 years isn't mourning, it's just a waiting period. I don't know why Uncle Callum doesn't see what she—" "Come," Winifred said. The drawing room door opened and closed. Nora stood in the corridor for a moment. She looked down at the sheet music, Scarlatti, Handel, a collection of Irish folk songs. She had been in this house 4 days, and she already knew that Louisa Potts was going to do something unpleasant. She did not yet know what. What she did not know, what she could not have known then, was the gloves. She learned it on the 5th morning. Delia had developed a headache in the night, and Nora came early to see if she was needed. And she pushed the bedroom door open gently, and found Delia sitting at her dressing table with her hands bare, turning them over in her lap like objects she was evaluating for the first time. Nora saw the scars before Delia registered that she had entered the room. They ran from the backs of both hands to partway up each forearm, old scars, pale and silvered with age, the particular marks of burns that had healed without proper attention, not severe enough to have been life-threatening, severe enough to have been deliberate. Delia looked up. The expression on her face was not shame. That was what struck Nora later when she turned the moment over in memory. It wasn't shame, it was exhaustion. The particular weariness of someone who has spent years bracing for a reaction and is not sure they have the energy to brace again. "Close the door," Delia said. Nora closed the door. She came to the dressing table. She sat in the low chair beside it without being asked, because she had learned from her father that you do not stand over someone when they are telling you something that costs them. Delia looked at her hands. "My father's hearth," she said. "I was 17. He had a temper. It came out of nowhere, usually. That particular time it came out of a glass of claret that wasn't warm enough." She paused. "I healed well, better than most, but the hands were always visible, and I was always young, and I learned very quickly that people's discomfort with what they saw was exhausting." She turned her hands over once more. "It's easier to wear the gloves, and it became a habit, and then it became armour, and then I couldn't remember what I'd been before I wore them." Nora looked at the scars for a long moment. Then she said, "Does Callum know?" Something moved through Delia's face. He knew. Before I married James. It was one of the reasons James offered. His family knew, and they were kind about it, and I was very tired by then of pretending. She was quiet for a moment. "I don't know what Callum knows now. It's been 8 years. Nora thought about instinct, about the feeling before the evidence. "Louisa Potts is watching you," she said carefully. Delia's chin lifted, just slightly. "I know. She's been watching your hands specifically." The silence that followed was the kind that does the work of a whole conversation. "Then we'll be careful," Delia said, and reached for her gloves. The dinner was Winifred's idea. She announced it at tea, a formal dinner, just the household and their guests, to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the Greyhollow estate coming into the Ashvane line. It had the sound of something improvised, a reason dressed up as a tradition. Nora spent the afternoon thinking about seating arrangements, which her father had told her were always intentional and never as accidental as the hostess claimed. She was right to think about it. They were seated 12 around a long table, Callum at the head, Delia to his right, Winifred to his left, and the rest distributed in an arrangement that put Louisa directly across from Delia and slightly down, with a clear sight line. Nora was a companion, not a guest. She ate in the small sitting room adjoining the kitchen. She heard about the rest of it from the housemaid who came to collect the plates, a sharp-eyed girl named Bessie who had worked at Greyhollow for 3 years and missed nothing, and from what Callum told her afterward, in a low voice, when he found her sitting in the library at 11:15 because she had not been able to sleep. What happened was this. The dinner had been going for nearly 2 hours. The main course had been cleared. The conversation had reached that particular elevated pitch of the after-wine hours when everyone speaks slightly too freely and no one quite notices. Delia was in the middle of answering a question about her late husband's trade connections. Calm, measured, her hands in her lap, when Louisa, reaching past the gentleman beside her for a dish of preserves, knocked against the serving girl's arm in a way that Bessie later described as not entirely accidental. The small glass dish clattered, nothing spilled. But it was enough commotion, enough excuse for Louisa to half rise from her chair, and in rising, to knock against the back of Delia's chair, and in the confusion of that moment, or what passed for confusion, to take hold of the long shawl draped over Delia's shoulders. She pulled it. One sharp motion. The shawl came away. Delia sat at the table in her low-backed evening gown, her arms bare from the elbow, and for one long breath the entire table went still. They saw the scars. The dining room of Greyhollow Hall did, in fact, have mirrors. Large Venetian glass set in gilt frames along the south wall, hung there by some previous Earl who had believed in maximising candlelight. The scars reflected back doubled, tripled, multiplied in the amber glow. Louisa said something. Nora was never able to get a precise account of what. Bessie was in the hall by then and only heard the after-silence, and Callum's recollection of those particular seconds was compressed by what happened next, which was that he stood up. He stood up, and he looked at Louisa for exactly the length of time it takes to make the message unmistakable, and then he looked away from her entirely, as though she had already ceased to matter. And he picked up Delia's shawl from the floor where it had fallen, and he folded it carefully in his hands. Then he sat back down, not beside Delia, in his own chair at the head of the table, and he said to the room in general, but to Delia specifically, "I believe Mrs. Marsh and I had been in the middle of a conversation about the Harrowfield mill. Mrs. Marsh, you were saying?" He turned to her, only her. Delia looked at him for a moment. Nora was not there, but she knew the look from later when Delia excluded it, the look of a person who has been waiting so long for something that they no longer trust it when it arrives and have to check it twice to be sure it's real. "Yes," Delia said. Her voice was steady. The Eastern contracts. They were James's strongest accounts, and the dinner went on. Afterward it was different. The kind of different that doesn't announce itself, but that you feel in the temperature of a room the way you feel a change in weather. Louisa Potts left Greyhollow the next morning. Winifred offered a reason. Her daughter was unwell. The northern air didn't agree with her. The journey back could not be delayed. Nora carried Delia's morning tea up the back stair and past Winifred in the corridor, and saw on Winifred's face the particular expression of a woman who has had a conversation with her brother that she had not expected to lose. She had not expected, Nora thought, for Callum to choose so clearly, or so quickly. Delia said nothing about any of it until the afternoon, when she and Nora were walking the long gallery on the east side of the house, where the portraits of previous Ashvanes looked down in the particular fashion of people who have opinions, but have been dead too long to express them. Delia walked with her hands loose at her sides. No gloves. "Did he come to you last night?" Nora asked. She had decided after some deliberation that asking directly was more respectful than pretending she hadn't noticed the library light burning past midnight. He did. Delia looked at a portrait of a woman in an Elizabethan ruff who looked as though she had found the world consistently disappointing. He told me he should have come to find me 8 years ago, when the decisions were being made. She paused. He said he convinced himself he was being honourable letting me go, not burdening me with the estate's difficulties. He said James was a better option. Was he wrong? Delia was quiet for a moment. No, James was exactly what I needed, exactly when I needed it. She looked at the portrait. But I think Callum spent 8 years believing he'd failed me, and I spent 8 years believing I'd simply taken what was offered. And neither of us ever asked the other what they actually thought. A small sound, not quite a laugh. My father always said that most mistakes are just conversations that didn't happen. Nora thought about the courtroom, about evidence and instinct. What happens now? Delia turned from the portrait. She looked at Nora directly, and Nora was struck, not for the first time, by the clarity in her face when she chose to let it be clear. I don't know, Delia said, but I think I'm going to stop wearing the gloves, at least in this house. She looked down at her hands, at the old scars, silver in the gallery's pale light. They were always armour, and I'm tired of needing armour. Here at least, that seems right, Nora said. They stayed 6 weeks instead of 3. Nora had expected to feel like a surplus piece of furniture, companion to a woman who no longer needed the particular form of companionship she provided, which was mainly the service of being another person in a room so that the silence didn't press too hard. Instead, she found herself useful in ways she hadn't anticipated. Callum had a dispute with a neighbouring landowner over a water rights claim that had been running for 2 years without resolution. Nora's father had handled 3 water rights cases during her childhood, and she had read every document in his study. She sat in on the meeting with the solicitor, and when the solicitor made an error in his reading of the original deed, a small error, a reversed date, she pointed it out quietly, and the claim resolved itself within the fortnight. Callum looked at her differently after that, not inappropriately, with a particular attentive respect that Nora recognised as the thing she had always wanted from people and rarely received from the right ones. You ought to have been a lawyer, he said to her once, at the end of a long evening reviewing correspondence. My father said the same thing, Nora said. He said the law was the only honest profession because it required you to admit what you didn't know. Callum smiled at that, a slow, considered smile, the kind that meant a person was actually thinking rather than performing. He sounds like a good man. He was. He was also terrible with money, so perhaps not entirely good. She hesitated, then said, He would have liked this house. It's a house that rewards people who pay attention to things, Callum said. Nora nodded. She thought, Yes, it is, and so does the man who owns it. She did not say so. The evening before they were to leave, though everyone in the house already knew they would come back, the way you know a thing before it's been spoken. Delia came to find Nora in the small room off the garden that she'd been using as a sort of unofficial study, papers spread across the table. The water rights deed annotated in pencil in 3 different places. She sat in the chair across from Nora. She looked like herself, which was something that had shifted in the 6 weeks here. She looked like herself in a way she hadn't when they'd arrived, when she'd looked like a careful version of herself, the performance of a woman at ease. I need to tell you something, Delia said. You're not going back to London, Nora said. Delia paused. Then, I'm not going back to London, not permanently. I know. Do you mind? Nora looked at the water rights deed. She thought about her father's house sold to pay his debts. She thought about her aunt's house in Bristol, with its low ceilings and its smell of old preserves, and its assumption that Nora would simply diminish until she fit the space available. She thought about 6 weeks in a house that rewarded people who paid attention, working with documents that mattered, feeling, for the first time in a long while, like the size of herself. I have a proposal, Nora said. If you're staying, the estate accounts are managed by a man in Harrogate who comes once a quarter and charges 4 times what the work requires. I looked at the ledgers when Callum asked me to check a figure last week. They're not a disaster, but they could be considerably better with some attention. Delia looked at her for a moment. Then the expression on her face became something warm and dry and amused. The expression of a woman who has just recognized something she had already suspected. "Are you proposing to become the estate accountant?" "I'm proposing that there might be a use for a magistrate's daughter with a head for figures and a low tolerance for sloppy bookkeeping," Nora said, "within whatever arrangement is reasonable." Delia nodded slowly. "I'll speak to Callum." "You were already going to speak to Callum about a great many things," Nora said. "This can be one of them." Delia laughed, a real laugh, short and sudden, the kind that surprised the person producing it. It was, Nora realised, the first time she had heard it. Callum and Delia were married in March, in the small stone church at the edge of the Greyhollow land, where 3 generations of Ashvanes had been baptised and buried, and occasionally both. The ceremony was brief, and the gathering after was not large. Neighbours, a few of Callum's old friends from his time in London, the solicitor who had by now developed a tremendous respect for Nora's eye for erroneous dates. Delia wore pale blue, not white, because she was a widow and did not pretend otherwise, and because, as she told Nora while they pinned her hair that morning, she had never liked white. She wore long sleeves because it was March and genuinely cold, but the sleeves were silk and they were slightly sheer, and if you looked you could see the line of old scars beneath them, faint as watermarks. She did not seem to mind. Nora stood at the back of the church, where she could see everything. She saw Callum turn when Delia came through the door, and she saw what happened to his face when he did, and she thought, that is the look of a man who has been waiting for something, and is astonished to find that what arrives is even more specifically itself than he'd remembered. She thought her father would have called that testimony if he'd been there to see it. He wasn't, but she thought he would have approved of the evidence. The water rights dispute was fully resolved by April, and the estate accounts were, Nora confirmed with some satisfaction, considerably improved by June. She took a room in the east wing that had formerly been used to store excess furniture, which she had rearranged until it made sense, because she had discovered that she liked best the rooms that she had made into something herself. Winifred Potts sent a congratulatory letter that was 3 pages of careful prose containing precisely 2 genuine sentiments, and everything else wrapped in enough silk to start a small trade. Nora filed it under correspondence requiring no response. Louisa sent nothing. That fall, Delia began, in the evenings, to sit by the library fire with her hands simply in her lap, bare, the way hands are when they are part of a person who is no longer waiting for something to go wrong. She did this so naturally, so without ceremony, that Nora wasn't sure she had noticed herself doing it. Callum noticed. Nora saw the moment he did, a brief stillness, a shift in the quality of his attention, and she saw him choose wisely to say nothing at all. He simply reached across and covered her hand with his. Outside, the moors were going brown and gold, and the windows were doing what they always did at Greyhollow, which was hold the light longer than you expected them to, as though the house had learned, across its long life, that evening comes for everything eventually, and so the only reasonable response is to keep the candles burning a little past the point when you need them. Nora turned back to her ledgers. She was, for the first time in a long time, exactly where she ought to be.